back, everyone. This is the fifth and final section of our Chapter 11 lecture series. This one is entitled Resistance to Slavery. The focus question for this section is, what were the major forms of resistance to slavery? African American slaves in the southern United States certainly did not sit idly by and passively accept their lot in life. With that being said, however, slave revolts were smaller and less frequent than in many other countries that had the institution of slavery. A big part of this reason was that the slaves were vastly outnumbered by the white population, and they certainly understood that. They were also faced with an entire system whose infrastructure was devoted to preserving the institution of slavery. So, as a result, much more common than revolt or rebellion was what has been termed silent sabotage. The day-to-day sabotage of the plantation and the agricultural process through which slaves carved out small spaces of autonomy within the larger structure of oppression. Things like doing poor work, breaking tools, stealing food, faking sick, and so on were all tactics and techniques that the enslaved used to undermine the institution itself. Least common were more drastic measures like arson, poisoning, and armed assaults against whites, although that certainly did occur from time to time. Reflecting that innate desire for freedom that we discussed in the last section of this lecture series, escape or running away was also a common form of slave resistance in this period. Although most slaves who attempted to run away were generally caught and returned to their owners. The Underground Railroad developed in this period as a way to facilitate the escape of the enslaved population from the South. This Underground Railroad, as it has been called, was a loose organization of sympathetic abolitionists who formed to assist these runaway slaves and will provide shelter in homes or farms along specific routes through the North that allowed these slaves places to hide from those that were seeking to recapture them. Most who escaped via the Underground Railroad ended up in Canada, as Canada was the only place that the fugitive slaves were completely free from the potential to be recaptured and returned to slavery. Harriet Tubman, the woman you see here, was a former slave herself who became the most prominent conductor of the Underground Railroad and took on dozens of missions where she returned to the South to guide some of these enslaved escapees out of the South into the North and some on into Canada. The runaways became a major area of concern between the North and South and fueled the tensions between the two regions leading up to the Civil War. Runaways in general undermined the pro-slavery propaganda emerging from the South at this time that described the slaves as generally contented with their lot and more than happy with their condition on the plantations. Northerners also became increasingly reluctant to participate in the capture of fugitive slaves, which helped to heighten the tension between regions as well, as Southern slave owners increasingly demanded that slaves who had escaped to the North be recaptured and returned to their owners. Although slave revolts were rare, some did occur in the U.S. South in the antebellum period. Although none of them were successful, slave uprisings did serve to stoke white fears and provoke backlash that tightened masters' control over the enslaved population. The four largest conspiracies of this period happened within the space of 31 years. The first was Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which we have previously discussed in an earlier lecture series. The second was the New Orleans Uprising in 1811 that came very close to capturing the city of New Orleans itself. Then there was Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in 1822. Now, although this conspiracy didn't result in a revolt, as it was caught before the revolt had actually taken place, the conspiracy did lead to secret trials and the executions of 35 slaves and free blacks, including Mr. Denmark Vesey himself, which the conspiracy is named after. The fourth and most prominent of these slave revolts during this period was Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Nat Turner was a slave preacher in Virginia who claimed to be guided by God to kill all the whites and free all of the slaves. The slaves under Turner marched from farm to farm, assaulting and killing dozens of whites, mostly women and children. The slave rebels were quickly captured by the Virginia militia and executed by the Virginia government. However, this rebellion sent shockwaves through the entire South. It also inspired heightened abolitionist efforts in the North. The state legislatures in the South, beginning with Virginia, where the rebellion took place, tightened the chains of bondage and began enacting new laws to further restrict slaves' movement, slaves' freedom, and masters' control over the enslaved population in hopes to avoid a future rebellion and the murder of the white population like that experienced during Nat Turner's Rebellion. Well, that's it, gang. That concludes the fifth and final part of our Chapter 11 lecture series on the Peculiar Institution. As always, I hope you learned a lot. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.